You twist the cap, take a sip, and trust what's inside is clean. Researchers have found up to 240,000 nanoplastic particles in a single liter of bottled water. Some of those particles release compounds that activate estrogen receptors in human cells. Leave that bottle in a warm car, and chemical migration spikes within 48 hours. The dangerous truth hiding in your daily water starts not with the water, but with the plastic. Inside the clear plastic walls of a sealed water bottle, the story looks simple. Pure water, untouched by anything but the mountain spring or municipal tap where it began. But under a microscope, that illusion shatters. Sherry Mason, a chemist who has spent years dissecting the contents of bottled water, has made a career out of counting what most people never see. Using optical microscopy and a battery of sieves, her lab has sifted through hundreds of bottles from leading brands. The results are impossible to ignore. In one landmark analysis, Mason's team found microplastics fragments and fibers in 93% of bottles tested. Some samples contained more than 10,000 visible plastic particles per liter. More recent breakthroughs using advanced laser imaging have pushed that number even higher, up to 240,000 plastic particles in a single liter, most so small they slip past traditional filters. The source of these particles is not a distant factory or polluted river. The plastic comes from the bottles themselves. Every twist of a cap, every bump during shipping, every hour spent sitting on a shelf or in a warm car causes tiny flakes and threads of polyethylene terephthalate, PET, to shear off into the water. Even untouched bottles straight from the packaging line are laced with microplastics before ever reaching a store. Mason describes it bluntly. We discovered microplastics are actually coming from the bottle itself. It led to the birth of this new area of research where people are monitoring takeout containers and various plastic items and finding out how they are constantly flaking. Particle counts vary widely. Some brands market it as the height of purity test among the worst offenders. In one survey, particle levels ranged from a few hundred to over 370,000 per liter, depending on the brand, bottle age, and handling. The majority of these plastics are smaller than a human cell, nanoplastics that can slip through most laboratory filters and potentially biological barriers in the body. The contamination is not limited to one region or manufacturer. Mason's findings have been echoed by labs in Europe, Asia, and North America, all pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. No matter how pristine the branding, bottled water is consistently laced with plastic debris shed from its own packaging. The industry's promises of purity dissolve under the lens of science. Each bottle, no matter how clean it looks, carries an invisible burden, hundreds of thousands of plastic fragments, swirling in what is sold as the world's safest drink. What began as a symbol of health and trust now stands exposed as a vessel for contamination. The question is no longer whether microplastics are present, but how much, and what else might be riding along with them. Polyethylene terephthalate, better known as PET, forms the backbone of nearly every plastic water bottle on store shelves. Lightweight, clear, and shatter-resistant, PET seems engineered for safety. But its chemistry tells a more complicated story. Each bottle is a network of repeating molecular units held together by strong bonds. Yet the manufacturing process leaves behind traces of catalysts, unreacted building blocks, and a host of byproducts. Some of these are known as NIS, which stands for non-intentionally added substances. These are compounds that were never meant to be there, but appear as a result of heat, pressure, or chemical reactions during production. Laura Vandenberg, a toxicologist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, has spent years studying how these hidden chemicals interact with the human body. Her research points to a troubling pattern. Certain PET byproducts, especially small fragments called oligomers, can mimic the body's own hormones. In laboratory cell-based tests, these oligomers have triggered activation of the estrogen receptor, a critical molecular switch that regulates growth, development, and reproductive function. The effect is not as strong as natural estrogen, but it is measurable. Even at low concentrations, Vandenberg's assays show that some of these chemicals can send false signals to cells, raising alarms about potential long-term health effects, especially during sensitive stages like childhood or pregnancy. The problem does not end with oligomers. PET's structure is designed for durability, but over time, or under stress, it can break down. As it does, more NES and other unidentified compounds can leach into the water, adding to a cocktail of substances whose combined effects are poorly understood. Standard safety tests often look for a handful of regulated contaminants, but they rarely account for these complex mixtures, or for the subtle ways in which endocrine active chemicals can interfere with normal biology. Vandenberg argues that the risk is not just about isolated molecules, but about the unpredictable interactions between dozens, even hundreds of migrating substances. PET was never intended to be a source of hormone-mimicking chemicals. Yet the evidence from cell-based assays and migration studies is clear. Bottled water is not just water. It is a constantly evolving mixture, shaped by the chemistry of its container. The illusion of purity, reinforced by marketing and clear plastic, conceals a molecular reality that is far less pristine. The next question is, how conditions like heat and time can tip the balance, driving these hidden chemicals out of the plastic and into the water people drink every day. Rolf Halden, a professor of environmental engineering, has spent years tracing the invisible journey of chemicals from polyethylene terephthalate, PT bottles, into the water they hold. In his lab, rows of clear bottles sit in temperature-controlled chambers, each one a quiet experiment in stress and time. Using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, ICP-MS, Halden's team tracks the migration of metals and organic compounds with clinical precision. The data tell a story that branding never mentions. As temperatures climb above 50 degrees Celsius, the rate of chemical leaching rises sharply. In less than 48 hours at this threshold, levels of antimony, a toxic catalyst used in PT production, can spike above the US EPA's maximum contaminant level of 6 parts per billion. Bottles left in a hot car or exposed during transport quickly surpass what months of room temperature storage would produce. It isn't just antimony. The same heat that softens plastic accelerates the release of a host of organic byproducts, including PET oligomers and trace phthalates. ICP-MS graphs show a steep, almost exponential increase in contaminant concentrations as exposure time and temperature rise together. Short-term heat abuse, like a weekend in a delivery truck or a forgotten case on a sunny loading dock, can produce chemical loads that far exceed what regulators test for in standard shelf life studies. And while most shelf life labels are set for moderate conditions, real-world scenarios often ignore these limits. Halden's findings strip away the myth of bottled water's safety under stress, revealing a product whose purity is only as strong as the weakest link in the supply chain. The result is a dynamic risk, quantifiable and immediate, that transforms the familiar bottle into a vessel for unpredictable chemical exposure. Labels on bottled water promise purity in bold type, spring-fed, ultra-filtered, pristine. Yet beneath these claims, a different reality lurks. United States regulations demand that bottled water meet basic safety standards, but those rules leave wide gaps. There is no federal requirement to test for microplastics, nor any legal threshold for the number of plastic particles allowed in a bottle. The Food and Drug Administration treats bottled water as a food product, relying on manufacturers to self-certify compliance. Testing for organic migrants, compounds like PET oligomers, phthalates, or non-intentionally added substances is left largely to the discretion of brands, not enforced by routine oversight. Even when chemical migrants are detected, disclosure is not required. The vast majority of brands do not list potential leachates, catalysts, or byproducts on their labels. Terms like BPA-free appear as reassurance, yet phthalates and other hormone disruptors can still migrate from PET under heat or long storage. In 2024, researchers identified more than 240,000 plastic particles per liter in some leading brands, none of which are mentioned on the bottle. More than 150 chemicals have been measured migrating from PET into bottled water, including substances with known or suspected endocrine activity. 18 of these exceeded European migration limits in some tests, but US consumers rarely see such data. Brands continue to market bottled water as the safest choice, using imagery of glaciers, mountain springs, or untouched nature. The reality, confirmed by independent labs, is that every bottle is a potential vessel for a shifting mix of microplastics and chemical migrants. The illusion of absolute purity is protected by regulatory blind spots and the absence of meaningful transparency. For consumers, the gap between what is promised and what is actually delivered is not just a matter of branding, it is a question of trust, shaped by what remains hidden on the label. Every bottle on the shelf is sold as pure, but PET plastics quietly leach endocrine disruptors and microplastics, especially as bottles age or heat up. The real risk is not what is listed, but what is hidden. In an industry built on illusion, trust in bottled water remains a costly gamble.